So, we need to learn to be in the system, but not of the anxiety. Recently, I had lunch with a friend. One of these friends that you can have great conversation with. In my life, the ones that I've had, many of the ones that I've had, fall into a category of loving to explore things and think about things. And several of them have actually been what I'll call farmers that think or farmers that read. And they have an interesting combination of being quite in touch with reality and yet also quite in touch with ideas. So I had lunch with such a friend, and part of what we were discussing was, of course, synodical happenings, denominational direction and the like, and its impact on congregations. And in the conversation, I don't remember exactly how it came up, but he recalled a quote from Rene Girard's book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. I have no idea if the camera, let me just check if the camera is catching that. I see Satan fall like lightning. And he was reminding me that he had found it so striking when he first read it that he had written it out. I think if I have it right, he has a notebook where he writes these kinds of things out just to kind of mull over the meaning of it. And I see the quote, the next day he sent it to me as I requested. I see the quote as having been prescient, seeing ahead. Already when Girard published the book in 2002, so he probably would have been creating it sometime before that. In fact, I think he's seeing things in this quote or in the book that didn't yet exist. That's what I mean by prescient. And I see also what the quote points to as something we need to be very aware of in our sense making. That's basically what I'm doing about synod and about denominational affairs. And yes, so this video will be specifically on those kinds of categories, but if you care to listen, you'll hear application to it in all kinds of places, or application in it. You'll be able to apply it in all kinds of places in your life. The trouble is with just sharing the quote, I've tried it on a couple of people, and about 5 words in, they're glazed over already, because it needs context, it needs background for it to make sense. And so that's part of the trouble that I faced in trying to think about how to present this thought. But there are at least 3 things that I need to explain and give background on to get at the meaning of the quote and the relevance that I see for us today. So what I've done is I've planned 3 scripts, 3 videos, posts, and I'll label them 8A, 8B, and 8C. The first one being considered to have been way back when I started doing sense making about synod. And after that, I might do an 8D, which would be implications for us as a denomination, to kind of wrap up that series of thoughts, because there's just too much to put it all into one. But that whole idea is so far in the future yet that I'm just focusing my mind on the one for today. Now, as usual, the written posts will be just my starting notes, what I'm using to guide my speaking, so that I'm not adding too much extraneous material. But it is true that I'm learning the video may contain additional thoughts that came as I was speaking to the camera. Some of those I come out of passion that develops as I share the concepts. So the first understanding that needs conveying is what is called systems thinking. And with that, some awareness following that, once that's in place, some awareness of what happens to a system when anxiety is injected into it. So what follows is my best understanding of these ideas. It's in my own words and my own concepts, because some of it I don't fully understand yet. Even with Rene Girard, I don't fully understand everything that he lays out. I'm not very good with abstract stuff. I'm better with stories and story analysis, the way my brain works. So my best understanding. Now, and I need to tell you as well that systems thinking is an important part of my approach and the approach of others to being a pastor, but especially to being a specialized transitional minister. It is also helpful in our sense making about Synod, as by the end of the series I hope to have made clear. A systems approach can be explained in many different ways. These are my words. It perceives a group, like a congregation, like a business, an office, or a denomination, or a crowd at a sporting event, as a living system, an organism, with many layers of overlapping interconnection. So there's this way and that way and this way. And within those layers, meaning connections that are constantly in flux, moving and changing. There are history layers. There are relationship history layers. There are emotional layers to this interconnection. There are the layers of past wounds. And there are many, many more of these kinds of layers. Key thing to be aware of is that systems thinking moves away from a mechanical approach that looks for direct cause and effect sources of challenges the system experiences. Systems thinking developed in the examination of how families function together, family systems, and has now just been expanded into groups and organizations because the dynamics are similar. So here's an example for those of you whose brain is like me, who need a story to illustrate. Here's an example, quite a bit fictionalized, although based on a real event that I witnessed. A pastor gets a phone call from a mother of a teenager, and the pastor is asked or invited to come and talk to the teenager because he's given his parents lots of trouble. He's especially in being disagreeable with his dad. So in this, the teenager's behavior was what I call the presenting problem or issue. This is what the pastor is told. The pastor visits and takes the teenager at one point to speak to him one-on-one and discovers that the teen is trying, in the best way a teen might try this kind of thing, to get the family to address his father's excess drinking. So in systems approach language, we have now found the real issue behind the presenting issue, or the one that comes out front. There's one behind it, and that is the father's relationship to alcohol. Now, to give you more of an idea of the layers of this, there's the presenting issue of the misbehaving teenager. There's the issue behind it of the father's relationship with alcohol and abuse of alcohol. Well, there's likely at least one layer behind that as well. See? So that's where I have this phrase that I use. The presenting issue is rarely the real issue when you're thinking systems. So if you are part of the system, especially the emotional life of the system, you will not be easily able to see what is really happening. Even possibly the wife that phoned the pastor didn't know what was really happening, just knew that their teenager was being a problem. In order to be able to see have a better idea of what's really happening, I don't think we can ever really get to it. You need to have the ability to gain emotional distance. You need to be able to get into an overview or bird's eye view or into a hot air balloon or get on the balcony, or various phrases that are used to describe this. Kind of watching it all from somewhat of a distance while still being connected with the story that's happening in order to begin to understand. Right? If the pastor in my example story had only focused on the misbehavior of the teenager and had taken the teenager aside and said, you must smarten up, that would be to have bought into the system that was as it was playing out and not taken some distance to think maybe something else is going on here. And if you can't get that distance, you will, I would say, unavoidably be swept into being part of reacting against, or of being part of what's going on, or reacting against it. Because even that is then being part of it. A family or a system can be healthy or it can be unhealthy. But because we are reformed and we understand depravity, we know that when there are humans involved, the general tendency will be towards unhealthy. Another way of referring to that is dysfunctional, not functioning well. And it's also been found that only fresh external eyes can get an idea of what's really happening, especially if it's really, really tense or really mixed up or really chaotic. This is where it applies to a specialized transitional minister. That the transitional minister is somewhat trained and equipped to come into a situation of a church and see it for the first time, see it from an outsider's perspective. The general teaching of this is that once you've been there 3 months, you won't, even the specialized transitional minister will not be seeing anymore because they are part of what's going on. An unhealthy family or family system or network of family systems, in other words, a congregation, can be dysfunctional. And in the dysfunction can be blind to its own problem or in denial about it, but it's mostly about blindness. I'll try and help you understand this by asking you to think of a few situations. Think of when you might have been a child or a youth and visited a friend's house, even if it was just for a meal or for an afternoon. And the moment you stepped in, something felt very strange to you. Not just the newness of it, but something else was in the air that you would not be able to describe, but you could feel. It might be exhibited in, for instance, no one speaking at the table. When maybe you grew up, that the dinner table was a very conversational place. But at your friend's house, the only speaking that happened was polite requests for things, salt and pepper. And you saw it as unusual, but you didn't know what was creating it. Here's another, a little more escalated example. You're at the friend's place, maybe it's for a sleepover or for a day, and you're shocked when you get into the house at the verbal berating that is doled out all around by everyone to everyone, pretty much, in that house, when that's not what you're used to. So, name calling, accusations of lack of intelligence are just thrown around all over the place, like it's just air. Those are systemic symptoms. And in a household, in a family where there is like an alcoholic, an alcoholic in place, or an abuser in place, these could be, they're not necessarily, but these could be indications or an acting out of the thing you felt the strangeness about the moment you walked in. There are places like that where you walk in and you just feel tension and you don't know what's going on. Here's another version. Think of a time when you've been at a meeting and a moment comes where the whole atmosphere changes. Just like that, someone stands up, says just a few words, or even sometimes in just the way they stood. The whole situation becomes tense, charged, loaded, anxious, freighted with danger. Classic examples outside of the church would be city hall or town hall meetings where a controversial decision is before the city council, and then someone stands up to protest, and by however they do it, they raise the anxiety level in the room. So these are moments, hopefully you see that now, that anxiety is in the system or it enters the system. Oh, by the way, in the last example, I'm also thinking of congregational meetings that you might have experienced, where everything's humming along and then suddenly someone speaks up and everything changes. It can also happen in a different way where there is tension and then somebody cracks just the right joke where everybody's suddenly kind of giddy, but it's usually because they're happy to have escaped the tension for a moment, to have had it released. I'll give you this example. I once had a situation where with a council, I was practicing having a discussion, a debate, but because they had difficulty making decisions under pressure, we chose a topic, and the topic doesn't really matter, but that they felt was rather irrelevant to them in that time in their church, and that there was no decision having to come out of the discussion. They just wanted to practice having a discussion. And so the topic was introduced and everybody was given around the table a chance to address it. And this one young elder spoke up, and he had, as he was speaking, he stood. Nobody else had stood before to give their version. And he visualized grandparents rolling over in their graves and all kinds of catastrophizing if this particular thing happened. And I was watching the room, and people were starting to hold their breath, and people were starting to freeze up, and nobody was moving anymore. And then the young man finished his speech, and everybody just kind of sat there in a stunned version of anxiety, deer in the headlights. Like, what was that? And then I said, boy, you said that with a lot of energy. And the whole room cracked up because I had named the tension and then I released it at the same time. And that gave people an opportunity to see how that works. All right, I got off on a sidetrack here. So those are moments when anxiety is brought into the system or is in the system or enters the system. The anxiety temperature changes. I first learned to start watching this in myself personally, and then beyond that in a group when I worked for a time in an addiction treatment facility. I began to learn to identify what I was feeling because as a chaplain, spiritual director in that place, I sat in on some of these group therapies where the counselors would be asking clients, patients, so how are you feeling right now? And they would say fine, and they would say fine's not a feeling. And they had this whole wheel with zillions, it seemed, of feelings listed on it that follow on each other, a circle. And then they would start the process of teaching an addict who's entered recovery into actually naming their feelings, because some addiction, much addiction is about numbing, putting away feelings. People have not been taught to have that. So, and then out of that, I began to notice when feeling changed in me in a situation where I would never have noticed that before, but then also how when I was in a group, there would be a change in the mood, a change in the atmosphere, a change in the feeling. The anxiety temperature would change. And so there they used the language of, well, what just happened when something like that would happen, to help everyone in the room start to see how this works. And also give them the tool of 1 to 10, what's the anxiety level in the room? And then after something like that happened, ask the whole group to name it. What 1 to 10, what's the anxiety level in the room right now? They increase awareness and they diffuse the anxiety, because some people, especially addicts, are very good at raising the anxiety level. At that time, I was middle-aged. I was in my 40s, and no one had helped me identify my own feelings or monitor the feelings in the room. And so my best understanding, thinking back on my life, is that then I was affected by those like the tides, like waves, and I would be reacting or participating completely unaware of what was going on. I've learned about much of this from a book by Peter Steinke called Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times. I just need to make sure I'm holding it right. Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times. Okay, hang on there. And maybe a better one that I would recommend is this one by him, How Your Church Family Works. When I work as an STM in a congregation, I do workshops out of what I've learned from this book. And people have found it very, very eye-opening, as I just explained for myself, that I found it eye-opening to learn to identify my own feelings, what's going on for me, and then also what are the feelings, what's the anxiety level in the room. Congregational leadership in anxious times, being calm and courageous no matter what. Now, even though I've read both books, I'm not very good at staying calm. That's still a work in progress. There are other books that deal with this subject as well. There are programs that you can take that deal with, that give you training in being what's called a non-anxious presence. So our congregations, our synod, our denominations are systems like what I'm describing, like family systems multiplied. And there is today anxiety in the system. And it showed at Synod, particularly Synod 2023. Various forces are enhancing our sense of anxiousness these days. There's a whole video possibility there, a whole blog post video combination. And these are forces that are increasing in influence on us today. I recall many years ago being on a committee with a person at that time older than myself, who, before we could really get down to the work of the meeting, there were just 4 of us, sometimes 3 of us in the meeting. This person would need to talk for roughly half an hour each time about what the 24-hour news channel she had on all day had put into her mind and her heart. She might even have been a bit addicted to the anxiety that the news caused her. It's like she needed this. And our opening devotion and our opening prayer did not ease her anxiety. She needed to speak those anxieties into our meeting each time. When the possibility of shutting off the news was suggested, she was baffled by that suggestion. It was out of the question. Today, most of our social media does something similar to the 24-hour news being on all the time, but it is worse, because the media that we consume, for most of us, has intelligences behind it that feed us still more of what disrupts our peace. Again, whole other topic, worth exploring more. When such acute anxiety strikes an individual, research has shown, when anxiety strikes an individual, research has shown, and experience verifies, the thinking part of the brain the frontal cortex shuts down. And the survival portions of the brain, closer to the brain stem, they take over. There's a deliberate process of, okay, no time for thinking, close it off. Acute anxiety is what happens when a truck is suddenly veering towards you. You do not stop and think, oh, a truck, I better get out of the way. Your body, seeing the evidence, reflexively goes into motion and you act to save your life or even that of somebody with you. I love watching these interviews of these heroes that have done things like that, run into a burning building or whatever, and they consistently do not see themselves as heroes. They consistently say, anyone would do this, what I did, and they also consistently say, I didn't think about it, I just did it. That's a survival portion of the brain taking over from rational thinking. When acute anxiety enters or is amplified in a system, say a congregational meeting or a synod session, rational thinking capacity is severely diminished, and various reactionary patterns kick in. They are commonly known as fight or flight or freeze, or a newer one is fawn, kind of appear to be appreciative of the challenge, or in order to appease the thing challenging you. Oh, Sam, it's going to be okay. Why don't you and I talk about this after? If Sam has stood up and said something that creates anxiety in the room. There's a whole package of these. But this is different. Acute anxiety is emergency anxiety. But there are people who are anxious all the time, like the lady I spoke of. And that's called chronic anxiety. And guess what? Chronically, in anxiety, consistently, the frontal cortex is out of the loop. Because they're perpetually fretting about the news or their anxiety of choice. Or if a system, and so now we go to a system, if a system is permanently anxious because, for instance, there's a pandemic or another problem, then in that system, very few people will be able to think clearly and feel discerningly about what is actually going on, what is actually presenting. And when that happens, reactionary decisions or otherwise poor decisions, rash decisions, quick decisions, impulsive decisions will be being made, which only adds to the dysfunction of the system. So that's the best, briefest background I can give to help you start to understand systems thinking and the dangers of anxiety, particularly chronic anxiety, to the well-being of that system. The second building block of my sense-making series will be about the mimetic theory of Rene Girard. And so I'll be releasing that when I get it done, probably in a few days, or I'll give it, even if I do it right away, I'll release it in a few days to give people time to digest. So, we need to learn to be in the system in order to see how it works. But we need to learn to be not of the anxiety. We need to inoculate ourselves and mask ourselves from the anxiety infection in order to function well.